Awesome, thank you. Welcome everybody. As I said, my name is Eileen Clancy. I'm the managing editor for Lifecycle Journal. The purpose of the webinar today is really to further introduce the Lifecycle Journal in terms of general concepts and the vision to people, but specifically with a lean towards researchers who might be interested in submitting. So we're going to talk in a bit more detail about the submission process and some of our editorial policies and journal requirements. And as Amanda said, if you can put the questions in the Q&A, there's a couple points towards the end of the presentation where I'll pause and we can address any questions that come up. But for now, I'll just kind of plow through a little bit. So on the agenda, I've kind of divided this into three parts, just speaking generally about the vision for Lifecycle Journal and why we're embarking on this project. Moving into the editorial, publishing, and evaluation processes and policies, where I'll kind of break down exactly what happens to a paper when it's submitted to Lifecycle Journal. And then hopefully we'll have time to actually walk through the submission process itself, as in what buttons to click and kind of what that looks like, which is kind of a big agenda. So hopefully we'll get through it. So in terms of the vision, what we're really trying to do is address existing problems that exist in scholarly communication. So our current system of scholarly communication has remained relatively unchanged, since its inception with physical papers. And because it started as physical papers, there's certain characteristics built into the evaluation system that, were necessary at the time. So it's outcomes based and only the paper was assessed, right? So if you think back to when we're actually mailing papers in and out of offices, it was difficult to mail large data sets or whatever. So it was just the paper and just the outcomes that were evaluated. Reviewers were ad hoc and it was generally only holistic. And it was dichotomous. You're accepted or you're rejected, and that's it. And a lot of that happened behind closed doors. Reviews weren't always necessarily changed, or it wasn't known how decisions were made. And that's had its impact on the reward system for scholars, for how they engage with the system, which is basically that scholars are rewarded for novel, positive, tidy results that package well into that paper format. There's historically not been data, materials, and process assessment. And then as I said, the reward system is dichotomous. It's accepted or not. You succeeded or you didn't. And it's often opaque. It might not necessarily be always clear why something was accepted and something was objected or not. And there's kind of discrete rewards based on that. And that reward system then has an impact on knowledge production itself. So, you can have, it's in that system with the physical papers, it's hard to correct allow self-correction of processes and problems that are viewed. Low credibility research there's not a lot known about what went into the research and how it was produced. The reward systems can be unreliable and, like I said, it's opaque. It's not always clear why something was accepted or rejected, and not necessarily aligned with the values of research itself. And then, of course, this has led over the years to predatory journals, paper mills, fraud, and issues with trying to sort of game the scholarly communication system itself in order to achieve those rewards that, can often be misaligned. And so even now in the age of digital communication, not much has changed, despite the fact that sort of that technical aspect of how we can share has greatly changed. Now it's much easier to share the data. There's no reason that we should only be sharing the paper. And so why hasn't the system changed more? And there's impediments to evolving the system. There's just general inertia. This is how we've done it, so this is how we do it now. There's justification of the existing system of, well, it works, like we've done this. It allows for effective evaluation. Publisher business models, publishing is a business, and there's economic incentives to maintain the system as it is. And then there's also just understandably, there's the concern of risk, and there's an aversion to risk and uncertainty. And so that can also impede change. But the problem is that scholarly communication can itself actually inhibit research progress. And that can happen when scholarly communication is slow or incomplete or opaque. But what if scholarly communication could instead accelerate research progress, like I think is intended? So if we instead opened up the full research life cycle and evolved with the research as it's conducted and evaluated. So instead of a system that treats the paper as the only meaningful scholarly output, there could be a system that treats all processes, and outputs, so data, materials, code, outcomes, all those things as legitimate scholarly contributions. Instead of a system that offers, dysfunctional simplistic rewards, they're based on publication and status, how many papers did you publish and in what journals? What if we developed a system that based reward systems on diverse, meaningful assessment of research quality? And instead of a system that's calcified in legacy, commercial, paper-based business models and infrastructure, if there was a scholarly communication system that was governed, operated, and experimented with by the research community itself. And so that's kind of the background and the impetus for developing Lifecycle Journal. And Lifecycle Journal it's a research and development project from the Center for Open Science. And so this is our chance to sort of launch it and engage with the community and hear reactions and see how people interact with it. And the idea is that we want this to kind of evolve with evolving research needs. So simply put, Lifecycle Journal aims to, number one, shift existing reward systems away from publication of research output as the ultimate reward, and instead move toward rewarding the practice of rigorous science itself. It's hard to do good science, and having thorough evaluation of that and rewarding that process itself is a way to move away from just sort of the paper as the be all and end all for rewards in scholarly communication. We aim to treat all processes, outputs, and outcomes of research as meaningful scholarly contributions. So data sets that, can be used over and over again. The process of actually developing a research plan and evolving research as it goes. Self-correction once something's being put out there, and updating even after research is complete. That's all meaningful scholarly contributions. And then also to open up more of the research process itself for transparent evaluation and feedback. So what does that mean for authors then? So what we hope then that the Lifecycle Journal model aims to do is to enable researchers to share all aspects of their research, not just that final, nice, clean, completed output. To publish outputs in all stages of their research lifecycle, hence the name Lifecycle Journal. To receive feedback from community-led evaluation services. Update research with revisions, progress, and new outputs. Research isn't this static thing that happened in this one moment of time. It's an evolving process that continues on. We hope researchers are enabled to engage the community on the meaning, impact, and next steps of their work, and that they can be rewarded based on diverse and meaningful assessments of the research quality itself, not just the output. I'll get into some features here, but in the next section, I'll be kind of walking through the process of what happens during the submission and publication process for Lifecycle Journal. So hopefully that'll kind of shed some light on what we're doing here. But in terms of features, one of the things I mentioned was there's understandably an aversion to risk and uncertainty here. And, it's hard to ask authors to change their practices in terms of scholarly communication if funders and tenure committees, et cetera, aren't also changing along with that. And so we want to make sure that we're meeting researchers where they are and that participation with Lifecycle Journal is meant to be additive, and authors shouldn't be punished for, experimenting and participating in a new model. So with that, we want to make sure that we're meeting the current standards for credit and reward. So there's rigorous peer review. Articles will receive a DOI, and they'll be indexed to the extent that's possible. There's existing innovations that, I don't want to pretend that everyone's just in this kind of static traditional scholarly communication model and no one's doing anything. There's lots of innovations that have been happening and lots of groups that are pushing towards innovating on publishing. And so we're looking to merge a lot of those innovations into one solution. So the Lifecycle Journal is free to submit and free to read. There's no fees for authors or for readers. It's a publish then review. So once the paper is submitted, it is published online while it's undergoing evaluations. Can allow incremental contributions. So it doesn't need to be sort of a massive, like years-long research undertaking. That's the only thing that can be published. The review is transparent. We're using credit taxonomy, and also it's important to use an open infrastructure. So as I mentioned, this is an R&D project. So we are sort of trying to test the waters a little bit here to see what is needed. But as we sort of develop innovations and features for Lifecycle Journal, we want that to be done in an open infrastructure. And then we also want to make sure that we're fostering continuous innovation and introducing new innovations with Lifecycle Journal. So Lifecycle Journal employs a distributed review process via evaluation service partners. And I'll be explaining a lot more what that means in a moment. But it's basically using a marketplace of human-based, machine-based, and empirical evaluations. We'll have paper versioning and updated review available. And as I've hopefully mentioned, experimentation is built into this. We want to make this a community of practice to really engage with innovations and how we communicate research. And we want to make sure that we're collaborating with other like-minded organizations to drive the product. So I'm going to keep plowing through, and I think hopefully as long as we're on time, I'll leave space for questions after this section. But I'm going to go through the editorial, publishing, and evaluation processes and policies that we have in place at Lifecycle Journal, and hopefully that will shed a lot more light on some of the things I've only just touched on so far. So first of all, scope. For the journal, that we're trying to keep the scope as broad and as inclusive as possible, which means that it might evolve as we move forward. But currently, the subject areas that we consider are natural sciences, medical and clinical research, social behavioral sciences, and most humanities. And it must be the submitted work must be reporting empirical research. So we're not going to be publishing any opinions or narrative review pieces or editorials. It's just empirical research. And the scope in terms of subject area is basically determined by the evaluation services, by the evaluations that we have available to us. So that's why I say it may change and evolve in the future as evaluation services join on that have new expanded scopes and subject areas that they handle. Then our scope can kind of expand along with that. But the goal is to be as broad and inclusive as possible. as I'd mentioned, Lifecycle Journal, it's called that because we're trying to allow researchers to engage during the full life cycle of their research. At this point, we have two specific points at which researchers can engage, so two submission types, and that's at the research plan stage or as an outcomes report. Um, so the research plan, this is, as it sounds, it's the planning stage before research has been conducted. So this is akin to, if you consider like the protocol stage, research plan, pre-registration phase. So this includes the pre-registration itself, the protocol or plan associated with that. There may be any materials lists that are associated. If there's preliminary data or existing data sets that the work is going to be based on, that would be included. Um, uh, we're also, and I'll get into this as I walk through at the end how submission actually works. But researchers should be prepared to complete a research design template, which we have a template that can be downloaded and used, and make a statement about the level of bias for research plans. And we do require at this time that research plans have received ethics review and approval if needed. So that's taking place. That's one entry point for authors. The other possible submission type or engagement point with Lifecycle Journal is as an outcomes report. So this reports, as it sounds, the outcomes of completed research. This would be akin to a preprint. So it includes the manuscript, the data, materials, codes, links to if there are any existing registrations or a research plan. That would all be included in the outcomes report. And I should clarify too that we're really trying to empower authors to drive how they choose to engage with Lifecycle Journal, and you kind of set up, you get out of it what you put into it. And so authors do not need to start at the research plan phase. So you can submit an outcomes report without previously having submitted a research plan. That's fine. Or you can submit a research plan and then, choose to go through and also submit the outcomes report once the research has been completed. So in terms of submitting, once you have your work prepared and ready for submission, there's links on our website to submit. That's on the homepage. And I think, are planning on, I think Amanda shared in the chat maybe the link to our homepage, and we'll certainly be following up after this with any relevant links that are discussed here with resources and how to submit. But clicking on the submit button, that brings you to our submission page. And so submissions are actually being handled through the Open Science Framework registrations. There's this registry specific for Lifecycle Journal submissions. So anyone on the call who's already familiar with the OSF, that's what we're using for the submission system here. So as I said, I'll go through at the end and kind of highlight some of the quirks of the system for those who aren't familiar with it. But for now, just at a high level, once that submission is completed, we'll receive a notification in our end. And then the journal staff will be doing some initial editorial checks, very light touch, and these are happening before the paper is published online. So these include things like scope. Is it within the scope? So does the subject area match? Is it empirical research? And just making sure that it's appropriate in those ways for publication in Lifecycle Journal. Checking for completeness, as I'd alluded to, there's sort of some specific requirements for each submission type. So making sure that all the components are present. Policy adherence, we do require that submissions adhere to appropriate research and publication ethics. So that means that research involving humans or animals should have the appropriate ethical oversight. And then we do also require disclosure statements, and we'll get into those towards the end as well. But it's basically, we have a policy of Rather than explicitly requiring sharing of specific elements like code or data, we require full disclosure of those. So is it available? If not, why not? And if it is, how do readers access that? And then just a brief check for language. So at this time, we're only able to consider submissions that are written in English. And so this is just making sure that it's at a level that can be appropriately understood. So once this internal vetting step is complete, authors will either receive an approval notifying them that the paper will be published, or it'll be returned to draft and we'll send further instruction about specifically what issues need to be addressed. Or it could receive the equivalent of a desk reject. And so that would be in instances where something like the scope was the issue, or non-adherence for things like ethics research that, can't easily be revised or addressed with revision. There'll be a brief hold, so it won't be instantaneous. Papers will be published on the website within about 2 to 3 days of approval. That hold is partially technical, but also because this is all being posted live and everything is all the evaluations will be shared on the website. We do kind of want to give authors just that couple days in case, sometimes something gets submitted and then you think, oh, whoops, that had the wrong thing in it, or that's not ready. So there will be 2 to 3 days of kind of wiggle room there before it's actually posted live. And then once it's published to the website, then a preprint DOI is assigned. So looking at what will appear on the website. So the article itself will highlight the version number and the editorial status. So in this example, let's hope we don't get to version 10 on too many, but the letting people know that what version they're looking at, and the status is referring to whether evaluations are ongoing, evaluations are complete, or a version of record has been declared. Also, these will link to various aspects of the work, so the registrations, materials, code, and kind of offer a quick visual cue to what's being included and what's available with this manuscript. And there's also linked to other versions. So if this is version 10, then clicking on this button would bring up versions 1 to 9, so that readers are able to understand the current version within the historical context of what's being done with this work. So evaluations are invited once the paper is published. As I said, this is a publish before review model. So the paper gets published online and then evaluation is invited. And evaluations that are invited are based on subject area, available study components, and submission type. So let me kind of go over that a little bit more. Lifecycle Journal itself does not handle peer review directly, meaning you don't have an editor assigned to your manuscript who is inviting traditional holistic human peer review. Instead, we've partnered with external evaluation services, and these can be human-based, machine-based, empirical services. So it's a distributed model of peer review, basically. And it is a variety as well. Some of these services are offering something akin more to a traditional holistic human peer review, where some are looking at specific aspects. So for instance, on this list, only good antibodies is specifically looking to see the appropriateness of the antibodies that are used in papers. Or reg check is specifically comparing the published paper to whether if there is a registration, how similar that is. And then likewise, as I'd mentioned, we have 2 submission types. So 2 points in that research life cycle where authors can submit, and that's the research plan or the outcomes report. And so some of our evaluation services only consider work that's at one of those 2. So for instance, PCI-RR, Peer Community in Registered Reports, is only evaluating at that research plan phase. And pre-review is only reviewing at the outcomes report stage. So that's what I mean by some of those factors like scope and study components available will determine which evaluation services are invited. And it is the journal is making the decisions based on our agreements with these services about which ones should be invited. So let's take an example here. We have an observational health research paper that's submitted. These are the available evaluations. And so this is an outcomes report. So right away, any of the services that only look at research plans would not be invited. And then we look at which study components are available. So for this paper, there's no code included and there was no pre-registration, but data is included. And so we'd see some of those removed as well. And in terms of subject area, the PCI communities have very specific subject areas, whereas some of these evaluation services have much broader subject areas that they consider. And so that determines who's invited as well. So once the evaluations are invited, we consider that time then evaluations are ongoing or, the evaluation window is open. And the way we kind of determine the evaluation window will remain open until all invited evaluations are received or 45 days have elapsed, whichever comes sooner. So want to make sure that, things aren't just lingering forever and that authors are receiving their feedback. And so we keep track of which services have been invited, and when those are received. Once they're all received, then we send those evaluations to the authors. When the completed evaluations are sent to authors, they are also published to the journal website. And so you'll actually see added to that publication below the abstract an evaluations table that will link to what was evaluated by whom at what stage. So some evaluations, there may be multiple versions associated with a paper, but some evaluations might look at all those versions, some might only look at one. And then it'll link out to the evaluation. Most of these services, but not all, but most will publish the evaluations on their own website as well. So in this example, if Research Hub conducted the holistic human peer review, there would be a link to their website where they host the results of that peer review. Some of these will be hosting or will be producing reports. And so then the link would sort of just link out to the report. So just like in existing models of communication, scholarly communication, once the evaluations are received, authors then can go and take that feedback and revise and respond to evaluations and then resubmit. And so that process, as per usual, can continue as needed. The revised submission may or may not be sent for additional evaluation, and that's wholly dependent on what evaluations were invited, what was requested, and what was actually changed. So if, for instance, data 0 evaluated the data that was shared with the paper and that didn't change between versions, there's no point in sort of re-reviewing that. So the actual evaluation may or may not happen on each revised submission. The goal is, though, at least for a new submission, so the first version of a paper, that we want to make sure that they receive at least one evaluation that's from a service provider that provides holistic human peer review, so more akin to what people are used to seeing currently, and then additive additional review from additional services as is possible based on the submission. So through this process, as I said, kind of, revision and response to evaluations can be dependent on the individual factors for the paper, but authors can optionally declare, once they've been through this, at least once, can optionally declare the current version of their submission, the version of record. So then once an author declares a version of record, that's equivalent to a traditionally published paper. And so that would receive a research article DOI. I should point out here that that's optional. Up until authors declare a version to be the version of record, the paper and its associated evaluations would be considered a preprint, which means that authors would be free, if they so choose, to take that revised paper, take those evaluations, and submit to a traditional journal if they wanted to. And so that's kind of with in trying to decrease any concerns about risk with engaging with a new model of communication for authors. But for those who choose to, we will offer the version of record, which again means that you're publishing the research article with Lifecycle Journal. And once the version of record is declared, then it would be no longer eligible for submission to another journal. So if you submitted to another journal at that point, that would be considered like dual publication, and would not be allowed. So that's up to the authors. So one thing that you'll maybe have noticed that I have not mentioned is the role of editors here. And that's because manuscripts with Lifecycle Journal are not assigned to an editor and do not receive an accept or reject decision from the journal. So all submissions that pass that initial vetting step will be published, regardless of whether the evaluations they later receive are positive or negative. And we've removed the editor in that sort of binary accept rejects stage as a gatekeeper. So we want the journal to act as a facilitator for sharing scientific knowledge and progress, not as a gatekeeper. So authors are empowered to decide when they're done with the active phase of revising and responding to evaluations, and at which point, like I say, they can declare a VOR or go elsewhere if they chose to. But we do obviously recognize that editorial support is important, and there is a role for the editor. So we have a voluntary editorial advisory group for the journal that's responsible for advising on general editorial policies for the journal as that comes up, representing the interests and needs of the various research communities. With such a broad scope, we do want to make sure that we try to maintain as much as possible channels for input and feedback from various research communities, hear what those needs are. And then in rare instances, that advisory group would also be available for advising on specific manuscripts. So this could come up in issues where there is perhaps a specific question about research or publication integrity, or this could be if authors require specific guidance about their evaluations. So we are trying to make sure that authors feel empowered to respond as they see fit. Or if there was any questions, any other questions that might come up around specific manuscripts. So the editorial advisory group is available. It's a small but mighty group. We're hoping to expand it to make sure that we have appropriate coverage of the subject areas that we cover. But we do have that in place to try to sort of maintain editorial integrity for the journal. So I'm looking at the clock here. I think we have time to pause. I have not been keeping track of the chat or Q&A at all, so I will maybe let Amanda step in if there's any questions that have come up before we kind of walk through the specific process of how to submit.
Yeah, I can bring up a couple. Some of them I think, as you've gone on in the presentation, might have been answered, but probably worth revisiting. So a couple just about the differences in different maybe open science practices or what folks are currently doing. So how this is different than registered reports, how is this different than depositing outcomes on the OSF, or where is there similarities? So a few on those differences and similarities between specifically registered reports and just depositing things on OSF.
Yeah, sure. So, in terms of registered reports, it's really similar, except that, as I say, it's up to authors to decide. They don't have to start at the beginning at the research plan. They can just kind of enter Lifecycle Journal at that outcomes report if they want to. So it's a little more choose your own adventure that way. And then also with registered reports, there is that in principle acceptance phase, whereas here we don't have that step. So the paper is published, or the research plan is published and evaluated, and the outcome of that evaluation does not impact author's ability to submit then the outcomes report. Hopefully that's clear. And in terms of posting outcomes on the OSF, the main difference here is in terms of um, facilitating the evaluations and connecting researchers to the appropriate services that can give that in-depth and meaningful evaluation of what they've published. And then also that authors do have the option to declare a version of record, which would then, count as a published research article.
Great. Speaking of the evaluation providers, a couple questions specifically around Research Hub. So just one flagging Research Hub as one of the evaluation providers, and that what does that sort of collaboration look like? And then a continuation of that of kind of this all invited evaluations received for a specific publication, what that means, and then especially in regards to Research Hub, as this person is understanding Research Hub as offering ongoing peer review. So maybe just a little more on the evaluation providers and particularly Research Hub.
Yeah, sure. So there is a full list of the evaluation services that we are currently partnering with that's available on the website, and it has a little bit of a blurb about the services that they provide, and then kind of what validation that those various services have undergone. So that's available, and that's a dynamic list, which we're hopefully will be expanding as we find new people to partner with. Research Hub is an example of one of our human holistic peer review services. And the way that we're engaging with them is basically, for those who aren't familiar, Research Hub basically offers, I guess you call it a bounty or a payment, based on a cryptocurrency that they have called, I think it's Research Coin. So it's basically reviews are paid. And they do on the Research Hub. So we submit to them a paper that we are requesting gets evaluated. Research Hub then posts the bounty for that's available. And then reviewers can choose to review on Research Hub. And those reviews are evaluated by Research Hub before the bounty is released. So there's kind of a quality check to make sure that the reviews contain what they're supposed to. So then those are published on the Research Hub evaluation website, and then also linked to through the links on the paper with the published evaluations. And so Research Hub is a great example where there's some of these services where we might be engaging with just a certain aspect of what they offer. Research Hub offers additional, they're getting into grant funding as well. And so with each of these services, we may be partnering with them for only a specific part of their evaluation. And we're also hoping to offer community of practice for them. So an area where we're experimenting with even the holistic human peer review, or allowing services to see if they want to perhaps facilitate evaluation of a different type of submission than they usually do. So if they're focused on outcomes report, be able to trial what it would look like if they also considered research plans. So hopefully that was a little long-winded, but hopefully answered the question.
Great. And then one here about indexing. So that this person asks if we can clarify whether Lifecycle Journal is already indexed or in the process of being evaluated for inclusion in major databases like Scopus or Web of Science.
Yeah, so it's not yet indexed, so we'll be receiving DOIs through Crossref. So any indexes that pick up that automatically is where it'll go. But some of these, like for instance, specifically when we're talking like Scopus and Web of Science, have re like what's the word, like time re requirements, as in, you have to have been publishing for like a year or two before you can be indexed. So that's why I said index to the extent that's possible. So there's certain indexes where all new journals kind of just have to wait and publish either sufficient volume or sufficient amount of time before they can be indexed. We will apply to all the indexes, but there is also, for anyone who's been following, like specifically with Web of Science with eLife, there is potential that we could be declined by some of those traditional indexes. So the hope is that we will be indexed by things like Google Scholar, OpenAlex, but that will be kind of ongoing, and we'll have to apply for indexing as we get sufficient publication volume and sufficient just time that we've been publishing.
Great. I think just one more question, maybe I'll make it a two-part because I
Okay.
believe you answered this, but just the first piece, one question around the availability to publish in any other language than English. But the another question related to the model itself, and the question is, if the evaluation agencies start to take this into account, this kind of scholarly communication model, do you think that could lead to publishers starting their own life cycle journals and putting them back in this journal impact factor game?
Yeah, so I think in terms of language, yeah, so unfortunately right now English is all that's available. And that will just be, as I say, we hope to be as inclusive as possible. But for now that's all that's available. And in terms of adopting the model, yeah, the impact factor game is kind of always the problem. I think for Lifecycle Journal, for the model, it kind of uses some elements, I suppose, that were introduced from like the mega journal, which is trying to remove that perceived novelty and impact factor from it. So if the model was being kind of truly adopted from other publishers, then hopefully that would be maintained, which would hopefully stop some of the impact factor concerns. And then also just in finding ways and normalizing for authors, to have those evaluations of the research itself. I think there's this temptation to quantify everything, which is kind of how we, reduce everything to this simple metric, which is, of course, why we have the impact factor in the first place. But trying to shift that reward structure so that the impact factor is just not as relevant as it was before is kind of one of the goals of this. So hopefully we succeed in that. Should I continue on, Amanda?
Yeah, I think I'll keep track. If there are any other questions, I can keep pulling them in. And if there's time at the end, we can get to some additional questions. If not, we're happy to follow up too. But I think for time, keep on going, Eileen.
Absolutely. All right. So I wanted to just take some time now to walk through what the submission process actually looks like, which will be particularly helpful for anyone who is not familiar already with OSF, because that is what we're using for submissions. So as I mentioned, there's links on the website to follow to submit, which will bring you to the registration. And I do, before I pop out of here and start showing how the registration works, I want to call out as well, on the website under submission guidelines, right at the top, there's a link here to a step-by-step guide to the submission process. So that's very like what buttons to click for which types of papers. So that's an available resource to help guide potential authors through this as they're submitting their work as well. So I'm just going to click out of here to the registries. So if you click on that submit now call button, you'll be brought to the Lifecycle Journal registration. I'll just also call out if you click up there, there is also this step-by-step guide that can be found there. So that is guiding you through which buttons to click, how to upload files, and all of that. So that's available. To add a new submission, you just click Add New. This moderation button wouldn't be there for you. This is for my account. And so you just click. So probably the answer is no, there's no existing registration. You're creating a new draft for a Lifecycle Journal submission. And I think I have one here that I've already entered a bit to save us some time. So you're brought to the registration page where we're just intaking information about the manuscript, your title. The description of the work is a description in OSF. So that doesn't have to be an abstract. That can just be kind of your own description. That particular piece will not be published with the final article. That'll be associated with the submission registry. You can add authors. So you'll automatically be added as administrator, which is basically corresponding author role. And you can find other authors by searching for their name or by email address. So I won't actually add people here because it might be read people, but real people. But you can choose their role as either administrator, read only, or read and write. So basically, read and write is the default, and that would be appropriate for a co-author who is not intended to be a corresponding author. And then as you add those people, it will allow you to enter affiliated institutions. For license, there's only one option, CC BY, and that's because that's what we publish under. So authors need to make sure that everything that they submit is eligible to be published under that copyright license. And then just clicking your subject areas. And then the tags, it's free entry. You could write whatever you want. You could, whatever is relevant for your submission. For submission details, the corresponding author ORCID is required, and ORCID for any other authors is encouraged but not required. And so here we have instructions on how to enter. So last name, comma, ORCID, semicolon, last name, comma, ORCID. So just in the order in which authors are listed on the paper, enter in the last name and any associated ORCIDs. And then affiliations are also required. So entered in the same way. For author contributions, we're using the credit taxonomy. So this link here will take you to a list of contributor roles. So what you need to write down is which author has which contributor roles. So each author might have several, and each role might not be relevant for every paper. There's a definition of the roles to kind of help guide how those should be assigned. But you can just basically write the author's name and list their contributions. And this section will be included in the final publication. As I had mentioned in the presentation, there's two submission types, either research plan or outcomes report. When you're submitting the abstract, that needs to match the abstract in the submitted manuscript exactly. The keywords here, it's required, but free text, so you can write whatever keywords are relevant. Previous interactions is pretty open. That can mean you can write whatever you want there. If you had questions about this scope of the journal and receive specific advice from journal staff, you could put that in here, but it's generally provided for if you've previously submitted. So if you have existing versions that are published, or if you had an existing version that received a rejection decision, you would also note that here. You have the option to suggest and oppose reviewers. That is not required. To the extent that's possible, we will pass that on to the evaluation services, but just like with most journals, we don't guarantee that we would invite your suggested reviewers. And because of the nature of the services that we use, which is some of them sort of have specific communities, that have more voluntary associations. So some of them might not specifically invite reviewers. So you have the option to do it there, and it may or may not be used by the services. So when submitting submission files, this is one part that I want to particularly call out, as because it has a little bit of quirks. So first of all, you'll probably have noticed that required um, questions or entries have the little star. For submission files, there are some areas where something that's required for one article type, but not the other. And so it does not have a star, but it is still required for that type. So pay attention as you're going through to sort of the little description here. So for instance, the study design template is not required for an outcomes report, but it is required for a research plan. So even though that doesn't have the little asterisks, if you submitted a research plan without that study design template, it would be returned to you, so that you could add that. And the template is downloadable here, and you can complete that and upload. Likewise, for the response to evaluations, that's only relevant for versions that where there was a previous version that had undergone evaluation. So that would be required for those papers, but not for others. And same with a marked up copy of a revised manuscript. Um, if your manuscript has supporting information, that can also be uploaded here, and any additional files. And so what I do want to kind of call out, because it can potentially be a bit confusing for anyone who's not familiar with the OSF, is in uploading files. So for here, this is requesting a cover letter. So I've uploaded my cover letter, and then I can upload my test paper, and then I'll upload a study design template. And what I'd like to show you is, oh, it's taking a minute now. But for each of these, as you upload the papers, or sorry, upload the files for each question, it will populate all of these fields, which can be a little bit confusing for authors and can lead people to remove them. But if you remove a file from here, it removes it from all of them. So it's being a little slow, so it's not showing for me right now. But what will appear is, instead of this red text, let's see if oh, there we go. So you can select, and a blue highlighted file will appear here. And the highlighted files are what is actually being included in this. So basically consider this as these are the files available, and then you tag which one is actually the file for this question. And so I just kind of want to call that out. And so you would remove it just by clicking there. But, if I removed the study design template from here, it's actually deleting it from the system. And so then I would not be able to add it. That would not be adding it properly there. So I just want to call that out. The other thing I want to call out is in terms of disclosure statements. So as I said, we do require an ethics statement. So if your research involves human subjects, animals, or field studies, funding conflict of interest statement, so potential COI, and there's policies around that can be found on our website. I'm mindful of time here, so I'll just conclude with this. We ask about, in the disclosure statements, individual study components, study registration, materials, data, and code. And so what we require is whether it's available, not available, or not applicable. So being not available does not prohibit you from submitting to Lifecycle Journal. Our policy is that we require disclosure, not necessarily sharing. but it will limit the depth and amount of evaluation that you can receive. So if you don't share your code, then all the services that evaluate code won't be able to evaluate it, or for data, and you'll receive kind of a less in depth. So that's that kind of, you get out of it what you put into it. And we do require, if the data is not available, that you state why not. And if it is available, that it includes access instructions. So like a DOI or a URL that allows access. And this bias control statement is something else for research plans that's just declaring the level of data analysis that's already being conducted. That adds through some click-through options. Authors have the option of including a reporting checklist. So some submission types like uh, systematic reviews, for instance, they might want to include Prisma, but it's not required. And then finally, for author agreements, we just want to make sure that, you'll have to go through and click all of these, but it's things like acknowledging that's a CC BY license, that's published before review, this is undergoing third-party evaluations, and that the evaluations themselves will be published, regardless of whether it's a positive or negative review. And then also that we ourselves, as the Center for Open Science, will be kind of evaluating this process and the journal itself. So that's kind of that internal administrative research acknowledgement there. So yeah, we're just about 2 minutes left. That was kind of a whirlwind, but that guide that I directed you to will include that in the resources, and that's the real step-by-step that walks you through this submission process. But once you review this and submit it, then that will notify us, and then we'll undergo that vetting process for publication. So yeah, Amanda, I don't know if we have 1 minute. I don't know if there's any more questions or if we want to just wrap up there.
Yeah, I dropped a note in the chat that everybody could be on the lookout for a follow-up from us, and we'll look at the unanswered questions and provide responses to those that way. So, yeah, I mean, I think maybe just wrapping up on one question, there were a couple questions related to subject areas
Yeah.
available to
Yeah.
publish, and so maybe just clarification on that, and then also kind of connected. Can people publish non-typical research outputs? So replication studies were the example for that one.
Yes, replication studies, yes. And then in terms of as long as it's empirical, but yes. And then in terms of subject areas, you will see here like physical sciences and math is listed, but it was not listed on the scope. Unfortunately, that's because this page in particular is the metadata page for all OSF registry submissions, so I'm not able to change that. So do follow what the website says for scope rather than these options here. So yeah, mathematics is not currently within scope, and that's just based on the evaluation services that we're partnered with. Okay, I think we should probably wrap up there because we're right on time. I really want to thank everyone for coming. I hope that this was informative. We're excited about the journal. We're excited that people are interested in the journal. We're hope to be receiving more submissions. We've got a couple publications that are in the pipeline and will be up on the website soon. So that's very exciting. As Amanda said, we'll follow up with an email that has links to, I think, the slides, a recording, and then if there's questions that need to be answered or any other resources that were mentioned that aren't included with the slides, we'll make sure that those go out to everybody. But yeah, a huge thank you to everyone for coming.